Ladies and gentlemen, friends, on behalf of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster, a very warm welcome to the Abbey this evening for the Charles Gore Seminar. As well as being one of the most influential Anglican theologians of the late 19th century, Gore was a canon of Westminster between 1894 and 1902. And certainly since 1935, a lecture has been given in his memory. This year, the Charles Gore Memorial Lecture will be given on the 17th of September by Professor Safi Clarke, currently the Bishop Sundo Kim Chair in World Christianity and Professor of Theology, Culture and Mission at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Taking as his theme an invitation to speak theologically about the Commonwealth, that wonderful voluntary association of 56 independent nations, Professor Clarke proposes the title, A Theology of Commonwealth, From Word to Dreaming, From Wealth to Worth. He writes, a theology of Commonwealth arises from the common dreaming of God, i.e. the kingdom of God, which stretches to cultivate bonds with the afflicted, even as it seeks willing hands to be the earth's keeper. A sense of common dreaming, rather than the common word, which relates just to the peoples of the book, offers a much broader platform to include the multi-faith, including indigenous people and no-faith communities. He will argue in his lecture this autumn that a Christian commonwealth based on worth rather than wealth knits bonds of affection to bond with the afflicted. Bonds of affection to bond with the afflicted. Those considered worthless in an economy of wealth, mammon, add value, worth, to God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. Well, tonight's seminar is in preparation for his lecture, and Professor Clarke has sent 3 questions for our panelists to consider, alongside what they each have to say, exploring the Commonwealth under the themes of memory, identity, and hope. On my far right, the Reverend Dr. Ishaya Anthony is Westminster Abbey's inaugural Commonwealth theologian in residence. He is canon theologian of the Diocese of Khoi, Nigeria, as well as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Religious Studies in the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Rennie Chow Choi is public historian here at Westminster Abbey. She also teaches at Westcott House in Cambridge and most recently was Community Engagement Manager for Historic Collections at St. Paul's Cathedral. The Reverend Dr. Peniel Rajkumar is theologian and Director of Global Mission with the USPG and is part of the teaching staff at Ripon College, Cuddesdon. He has also been an adjunct professor at the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Institute at Bosse. You have more detailed biographies on your seats. So this is an evening considering theological and cultural reflections on the Commonwealth today, under those headings, memory, identity, and hope. You'll be invited to join the conversation towards the end of the seminar before we all move for a drink together. So I'm going to begin by asking each of our panelists just to say a bit about themselves in the context of this evening's event. How do you locate yourself in this discussion? And I will then begin to pose Professor Clarke's questions to each of them. So let's begin, Ishaya. How do you locate yourself in this discussion? Commonwealth, memory, identity, hope.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hockey, for this wonderful privilege to be part of the panelists to engage in this conversation, and greetings to everyone. When I look at my positionality in connection to the conversation tonight, I want to draw from 3 areas of my life. So the first one is I position myself within the context of this lecture as someone who is from an ex-British colony. So I come with a lot of things from that colony to say I represent my ancestors in different ways. I embody the pains, I embody the joy, I embody the sorrow and whatever you can think about that has to do with the colonial legacy within the context of Nigeria, where I come from. And then the second part is to locate myself as one of the legacy of the British colonialism. What do I mean by one of the legacy? I sit here as an Anglican priest. Without the British coming to Nigeria, I don't think I would be an Anglican priest. So I sit here as a legacy, of that British encounter and engagement with where I come from. And then the third part is I locate myself as one who has just been recently appointed to this position as the Commonwealth theologian in residence here at Westminster Abbey. So these are the three layers or the three identities in which I want to engage in tonight's conversation with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishai. Rennie, how do you locate yourself in this conversation?
Yes, well, thank you very much for the lovely introductions, and thank you so much for choosing to spend your evening with us today as well. I place myself in this question of relationship to Commonwealth with some complexity. I have ties to the beginning origins of the British Empire and to the end of it as well. I was born in Hong Kong and spent the early years of my childhood in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is usually understood to, with its handover to China in 1997, that event is understood by many scholars to mark the end of the British Empire. And so that's one kind of bookend. My teenage years and the formative years of my life were spent in Canada, and that in many ways marks the early start of British expansion, of the expansion of the British Empire. And now the entirety of my life as a mother of 3 children has been spent in the UK. So we have been British nationals for a good many years, and my children are being raised here. And so I find myself in the middle of, what was the metropole of the British Empire and the center of all the conversations about what it means for the Commonwealth to relate to former colonies. So that's kind of in terms of my personal history. Professionally, actually, my specialism was as a medieval historian. I'm a specialist in medieval monasteries, and one might ask, why would a Chinese person specialize in 8th and 9th century monasteries, specifically Benedictine monasteries in Western Europe, of which there's not any in Canada or in Hong Kong for that matter. And the straightforward answer to that is because my parents passed on to me an inheritance of faith and their love of the Christian tradition and Christian devotion and Christian spirituality. But they received that faith from missionaries from England when they were growing up in Hong Kong. And so there are a lot of very complicated questions for me about how I relate to Western Christian heritage. And it led me to write a book. It also led me more and more further away from kind of a specialism in medieval monasteries to questions about heritage and the legacies of colonialism in our material heritage in the churches that we have, somewhat kind of against my will, but as questions that I need to face in kind of personal honesty and for the sake of my children, really, as well, who are growing up here, having inherited these very difficult and complex questions.
Thank you, Rennie, very much indeed. Peniel, where do you locate yourself in this tonight?
Thank you, Jamie, for this invitation to be with you all here this evening. How do I locate myself in this discussion? Probably through the word dislocation, because for those of you who are from the Christian faith who know the name Peniel, Peniel is the story of two things. One is it is the story of the struggle of Jacob with God, but it is also the struggle. It's also the story of being dislocated. And that is how I would define myself, because on the one hand, I'm somebody who has struggled with the complexities of colonial and imperial histories and its intersection with Christianity and Christian mission in the Indian context as somebody from India. But as a liberation theologian, I've also seen how in the context of internal colonialism, for example, the question of caste, people from the lowest communities, the Dalit communities, have engaged with Christian mission as a way of liberation. That is one thing. In terms of dislocation, and this is where I can say a little bit about my family, my great-grand-uncle was involved with the formation of the Church of South India, V. Santiago, alongside Bishop Azariah. And therefore, against the flow of a Christianity which was often conflated with colonialism, they dislocated themselves from that stream of Christianity into a disruptive way, and then put together Indianness and Christianity together in the search for an indigenized Christian faith. And therefore, that dislocation, which disrupted the understanding of Christianity as being only Western Christianity towards an understanding of Christianity as being Indian and Christian, is something of how I would identify myself. So in my work academically, I also try to bring two streams which are close to my heart: interreligious dialogue and liberation theologies, and to see how these two can be in conversation. And given the diversity of the Commonwealth in terms of the many religions and the many poor, I think there's much that can be spoken into that.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for those words of introduction. And already we're touching on issues, contemporary issues, which relate very much to the past, to the origins of the Commonwealth, to the reality of empire, and to the complexity of religious expansion. And that leads us very elegantly into this first category much more deeply, the category of memory, the topic of memory and how to deal with it. So Sathi Clark asks each of our panelists, in what ways is your experience of the Commonwealth in the 21st century different from the memory of your forebears? In what ways is your experience of the Commonwealth different from the memories of your forebears? Ishaya.
Oh, okay. I still have to speak.
I'm afraid you have to speak. Well, you don't have to, but...
All right, great. Okay, thank you very much for that question. When I think about a question like this, the first thing that comes to my mind is to paint a picture of me and my grandfather having a dialogue, or me and my great-grandfather having a dialogue about this question. So my grandfather speaking, what do you think, at that point? I think one of the first things he will say to me about the Commonwealth will be his conceptualization, what he understands by that. He will look at it more as a kind of a social, political, and economic ideology, that moves towards the flourishing of the UK, getting to the flourishing of the UK, that whatever you get from different part of the colony should be sent here, for the flourishing of this place. So my grandfather might say that to me. And then the second thing that I think my grandfather will say in connection to his experience, it will be more to say he didn't have a sense of agency. His agency was taken away from him. So agency in the sense that when he is not able to ask questions, so you just do whatever you are asked to do. And when you try to ask question, it is categorized as being someone who is disobedient, someone, and things like that. So this might be some of the things that my great-grandfather or my grandfather will tell me as part of his experience. And, one other thing that I think he might possibly say to me will be to say that there has been a kind of, when it has to do with epistemology, the way of knowing, it got to a certain point where the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge system on how they know things was demonized, was got to a point where they began to have a doubt about their self-worth and their dignity. So maybe that might be his conversation to me. And then when I fast forward, and then my grandfather asking me, now what do you have to say about that? I think the first thing that I will say to my grandfather, and he will be very surprised, is to say I'm seated in Westminster Abbey. And he might be very, very surprised. And I think that has to do with the conversation that Pinel was raising around the issue of liberation theology. But I look at that more from liberatization, broadening the table, making room for more voices, within the Commonwealth. That it is not just the Commonwealth of the British, but now the Commonwealth of everyone, of different nations. So I think that in terms of memory, the difference for me will be more that I have agency now. I can sit and say some certain things that I believe, and things like that. And then the second thing for me is the fact that I'm not only speaking, but to a certain extent, my voice counts. I do not need someone to speak for me at this point. To a certain extent, my voice counts. And I think also very importantly, the willingness to engage in conversation, because the conversation is not just one-sided. So I will tell my grandfather that for what you see, there is a kind of a co-creation of knowledge, of meaning, of interpretation of the different things that happen before now. So I think for me, these are ways in which I can say that there is a difference between how I engage in the Commonwealth now and how my grandfather engaged in those days. And then finally, my grandfather will be very surprised if I tell him that there is a conversation around repatriation. He will be very, very surprised to hear that, okay, some of the things that were taken away, some are gradually finding their way back. My grandfather will no, are you serious of what you're saying, and things like that. So I think for me, these are some of the things that I would like to highlight in response to this particular question. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, so much there. I'd like to come back to in a minute. But Rennie, in what ways is your experience so different from the memory of your forebears?
Yeah, this question poses an interesting dilemma for me, because when I think about my experience, I don't really know whether I ought to think about it as a person of Hong Kong origin, or as a person of Canadian, or as a British citizen. And I guess to complicate things even more, when I tell the story about how I experience the Commonwealth as a former inhabitant of two former colonies, which organizing structure should I use to describe my experience? Should I use an autobiographical one or a chronological one? And so if I use the autobiographical organizing structure, that takes me to the place of my birth, to Hong Kong. Hong Kong's relationship with Britain began around 1842, when it was ceded to Britain following its defeat at the First Opium War, and then subsequently further territories around Hong Kong were additionally added as Britain's territories, and leased to Britain as well for 99 years. In the 20th century, Britain underwent diplomatic pressure to hand Hong Kong back to China. And so, as I mentioned before, 1997 is a milestone. The handover to China is considered by many to mark the end of the British Empire. Hong Kong was the last remaining colony, and Britain still has 14 overseas territories, but they're not kind of colonies in the classical sense, and they have political autonomy of their own. And very interestingly also, with the handover of Hong Kong back to Britain, that signaled the end of the colonial civil service, and that was decommissioned. There was a service at the Abbey to mark the decommissioning of the colonial civil service. So, with all this, Hong Kong is currently not a Commonwealth member. It didn't retain its special status within this organization, although I just learned that the youth of Hong Kong are eligible to apply and enter their essays for the Queen's Commonwealth Essay Competition. Yes. So anyway, this is where I would begin autobiographically. And as I mentioned, I moved to Canada with my family later on in my childhood. And this would take me to Canada. Now, chronologically, the history of Canada's connection with Commonwealth predates that of Hong Kong by several hundred years. With around the 1670s with the Hudson's Bay Company and the trade in furs and other items and wood, and then the granting of dominion status to Canada as a confederation of disparate provinces, now having a self-government but under British sovereignty, and this date is celebrated as a Canada Day on the 1st of July every year in Canada. What's special about Canada is that it went through a process in the 20s and 30s where it helped to establish for the Commonwealth the principle that dominions, so settler colonies like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada, of course, that dominions should be equal partners with Britain, not just subjects of the empire, but equal partners. And I believe this is, Canada's contribution to this conversation was the first instance when the term Commonwealth of Nations was in fact first used. It was used in 1926 at the Imperial Conference, and that recognized Britain and its dominions as equal in status at the voluntary association of equal bodies rather than subordinate parts relating to a superior. So, Canada is sometimes described as a founding member of the Commonwealth for this reason. And so in terms of how I relate to Commonwealth, it's as both an outsider and as an insider. Outsider if I were to kind of channel my Hong Kong origins, and insider as a Canadian. I think this is actually, this dilemma that I've just described points to a sort of theology of Commonwealth with which we must all start today, and that is the fundamental reality that there is no such thing anymore today in our plural context and globalization. There's no such thing as linear lines of transmission and reception, and this is what post-colonial theories are quite good at articulating. I just want to throw a few terms out at you because post-colonial theories have tried to emphasize this state of fluidity and hybridity, and that you can't actually pin down what your kind of essential nature is. Is it as a Hong Konger, as a Canadian, as a British citizen? Where do I start? Which century do I begin to tell this story? The British scholar Paul Gilroy, he coined the term Black Atlantic, for example, to refer to the transnational and intercultural space that encompasses Africa and America and Europe, instead of looking at the way we've historically looked at the history of chattel slavery as kind of following lines of quite linear lines of trade. But if we focus on the Black Atlantic as a place of mixing and exchange and hybridity, that's one way to challenge kind of essential identities. Tidallectics is another term introduced by a scholar which draws attention to the ocean's rhythms instead of kind of land-based ways of thinking. So how do we think in terms of island identities, floating and being subject to the waves and the movement of the oceans rather than fixed identities? And then two more just quickly. I like the image of the rhizome that some post-colonial philosophers have used. Rhizomes are underground plants, like a potato, that grow horizontally, and the roots shoot out in all kind of ways of length. And this is a model of identity that really challenges the idea that there's a root, a fixed root with one essence, and then branches and come out of a kind of a central trunk. But instead of potato, you can't find the center in it. And then similarly to that, Lots of scholars prefer to spell roots R-O-U-T-E-S, like a root, rather than a root, R-O-O-T, once again, to challenge this idea that we have to identify ourselves with some sort of fixed essence. Anyway, this is just to say that the Commonwealth today, the experience of it is no longer as maybe a conglomerate of fixed nation states, but really it's a center for interchange and cultural exchange and hybrid identities and fluidity. Commonwealth works as a historical explainer, but not so much when we put into the story our personal experiences and the history of globalization and pluralities and those dimensions.
Thank you so much. I think how globalization plays into all this, and what a nation state even is now,
yes.
Is a question we might come back to perhaps in a minute. Peniel, memory. In what ways is your experience different?
I think memory is always a complicated thing because it is not so much about what happened in the past, but also about what did not happen but could have happened. It is also about buried futures, right? And that always weighs on you, given that the Commonwealth was something of a post-war phenomenon. It emerged, and it was part of a movement where unity in the face of disintegration was seen as being the next way, the way for the world moving forward. I think there was a lot, when it comes to memory, people always, it may be imagined, it may be perceived, but still there is always this lingering nature of the buried futures. That is part of memories. What did we lose out in all that happened in the past? We may not know that, but still sitting with that uncomfortable ambiguity, I think, is what sometimes memory is about. Today, we are in this context now, looking at the Commonwealth. I see that as being, given that India now is the largest member of the Commonwealth in terms of numbers, right? So we see this as being a platform for greater interdependence among countries. And given the work that has happened during COVID and other things, I think India's position is slightly, different from the initial suspicions that India might have had about something like this. Because India came into the Commonwealth as a very unique nation state, right? It came into the Commonwealth as a republican form of constitution, but yet chose to be part of this Commonwealth, and that gave it. So it is by choice that India is part of this, and therefore at that time it was also. I think, when my parents and grandparents look at the history of the Commonwealth, look at the Commonwealth from this spirit, there is sometimes this suspicion. When Queen Elizabeth said in her Christmas broadcast in 1953 that the Commonwealth bears no resemblance to the empires of the past. It is an entirely new conception built on the highest qualities of the human spirit, namely friendship, loyalty, and the desire for freedom and peace. It might have been met with some form of suspicion. Whereas now I think in terms of moving forward in trust, when I look back at what has been achieved over the last few years, my memory of the Commonwealth is that it helped me to learn a new country, Zambia. Because the 1979 Lusaka Declaration on Racism and Racial Prejudice, something which was probably responding to one of the most painful sins and scandals of that time. That is my memory of even understanding the Commonwealth. It helped me to understand that realize that there's a new country called Zambia, and that something that happened in Lusaka was something that had global repercussions. So I think in terms of suspicion, in the midst of ambiguity, there is also this memory, this thin lining of hope that goes through when I think of the Commonwealth today.
Thank you very much. This very powerful sense of a buried future that you spoke of at the beginning. I wonder, asking all our panelists this, is it helpful to talk about about the healing of memories. Is that a good phrase in this context, do you think? Is that helpful?
If you want me to do that. I think that is the way towards the future, right? That is the future, that we go through this. If we need a future that is hopeful, and a future that is also in some ways holistic, where there is this assurance of wholeness and fullness of life, I think there is a need to engage with the issues of healing and reconciliation as a way to the future.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that and to raise a question. You know, when you talk about healing of memory, one of the thoughts that comes to my mind is, at what stage do you know that one's memory has been healed? You know, so these are questions that, you know, one still keep pondering about and things like that. Yeah, so I do not have any contribution in connection to what a healing of memory. I think it's more of a question, you know. If this is a way to go, what stage do you get to that one can say that his or her memory has been healed in connection to the past injustices and things like that? Yeah.
And there are all sorts of ethical questions there, aren't there? Not least whether a contemporary reality can speak of a previous generation. Is it for us to speak for those who have no voice? That's a very complicated ethical question, it strikes me. Rennie, what do you think?
I think there is a big effort in contemporary society to do exactly that, to attempt to heal memories, because a lot of the memories that are written in stone are the ones that are the most, that provoke the most pain unnecessarily. Actually, sometimes I think that society has moved on and the stones and the physical reminders haven't. Right, we've become united more or less, and we can coexist as a nation, and we all attempt not to be racist toward each other and those kinds of things. But there are the material legacies that provoke and that prompt the memories, and I think there's large movements today that are trying to address precisely this issue as a way of healing memories. And not rubbing salt in wounds, actually, yes, or reopening wounds that would have actually naturally closed already.
Thank you. Do you have any questions for each other on this particular topic?
Yeah, I have a question. So my question is in connection to what Rainey said and even what Pinel, in connection to the Commonwealth, talking about equal member states. So my question is, if the states are equal, then what happened to the head? How does the head remain in one place? And you still call that a kind of equal member state. So in your work, in your research, in your thinking, I would like to hear a little bit around that in connection to the independence, but also at the same time, the dependence. Yeah. So how does that connect with the question and conversation around memory? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, are you volunteering me?
Was that for me or?
No, I think for both.
For both,
if we can get insight from.
Neither of you is getting out of this, so it's
yes.
I have I would like to address that question actually with reference to the next
great.
question.
Okay, great.
Great.
So let's hear from Penny first then.
Correct. I would relate that to what Ishaya said about broadening the table, right? I think in many ways the idea of the Commonwealth as being kinship, where there is this sibling nature, I think if theologically speaking, it is a version of understanding the kingdom as kingdom, Kindom, where we recognize each other as common children under God. So the headship that comes from God places us all as human beings on an equal footing, and therefore to emphasize that as being, I think even in the London Declaration or for the modern Commonwealth, there was this recognition of all of us having the same equality, intrinsic worth, and the only source of that worth comes from God. And under that, I think there is this sense of understanding, this broadening of the table in terms of kinship, where we recognize each other as siblings who are called to share the earth, a common home.
Yeah, so a real sense of sibling interdependence, which theologically we might think of as communion somehow. Well, in which case, let's move on to the next section, which is on identity. And Rennie is keeping us on tenterhooks, going to answer Ishaya's question through the lens of this issue of identity. And the question that Sathi asks here is this one. In what ways did colonial expansion involve the painful loss of aspects of your communal or collective identity? How do you see your identity within the Commonwealth today?
Yes, no, Ishaya, your question is fantastic. And actually, I would like to answer it with reference to this question and then the third one that Professor Clark has asked. So I'll draw it right out. But for this particular question about the idea of a painful loss of collective or communal identity, today, to me, isn't that just another way of describing the state or the reality of diaspora? The loss of communal and collective identity is kind of synonymous, is a way of describing what diaspora is. And diaspora is the reality for so much of the Commonwealth, maybe in ways that weren't necessarily true 50, 60, 70 years ago. But it certainly holds true for the people of Chinese descent. As a person of Chinese descent, I don't live in China. I am part of the Chinese diaspora. And the Chinese diaspora is one of the largest, most widespread in the world. And the Chinese diaspora was shaped by forced and voluntary migration within often the framework of colonial expansion. And Chinese communities settled in far-flung places, places as diverse as Southeast Asia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, many parts of Africa, all kind of former British colonies. So I guess you could say that colonialism disrupted existing networks of Chinese identity in several ways. I mean, first and foremost was the reliance on colonial labor systems. In fact, today I was in Limehouse, and the East India Company employed Chinese seafarers in the 18th and 19th century, and when they came, many of them lived and eventually settled in the Limehouse area, so that is the kind of original Chinatown before the one that we know as Chinatown in Leicester Square. Liverpool, again, is considered the oldest Chinatown by many in the world, and once again, that's owing to Chinese sailors, particularly from the region of my ancestors in the Guangzhou region, who settled in Liverpool during the time of expansive trade. In Canada, Chinese laborers worked on the Canadian Pacific Railway, many under very exploitative and harsh conditions. And so, I mean, if you ever wondered about the huge communities of Chinese people in places like the Caribbean or Latin America, Africa, many arrived in this period under heavily exploitative labor contracts, and many of them indentured labor contracts. For the Chinese identity, despite the crucial role that many Chinese men in particular filled in doing this labor that nobody else wanted to do, there were so many anti-Chinese laws. In Canada, when it was still under the sovereignty of Britain, the Chinese people were marginalized and faced anti-Chinese sentiment. There were exclusionary laws, something called the Chinese Immigration Act, in fact, in the 1920s. Australia had a similar policy. That being said, I am very aware that not all disruption to collective identity can be blamed on colonialism, and that's a very important point to make as well. I'm reminded that my own parents left the province that they came from for Hong Kong, as did many other peasants during the Chinese Communist Revolution and the upheaval that went on during that period. All that is to say that diaspora is a reality of Commonwealth that we sometimes forget in our kind of fixation on nations and representation of nations. We forget that there are many, for example, Chinese people in Singapore or Malaysia or Kenya or Uganda. And so the Commonwealth was built on the movement of people. I mean, that's what it was. I've already mentioned some of these phenomena of indentured labor, but also, post-World War II, huge waves of migration, as many of you know, that the UK relied on migrants to fill its labor needs. And then there's recent migration trends still. The diaspora movements continue with many skilled migrants today, kind of actively, professionals that are actively being recruited, for example, from India or Nigeria or Pakistan. And I just want to make a point here that diasporic communities still constantly reveal the struggle, right? The struggle with the legacies of exclusion and discrimination. We all know about the Windrush scandal, but there have been many before that as well. And then there are struggles kind of literally in terms of belonging that still throw up some questions today. The Commonwealth was once seen, perhaps still is, seen as a shared political cultural space. But in the 21st century, this is not literally true anymore. The Commonwealth citizens no longer have automatic rights, right, to live and work across member states. There are strict immigration policies. Although here in the UK, if you are from a Commonwealth nation, you can still vote in a general election. And every time a general election comes around, there are heated debates about why precisely that is and what the rationale is for that, which is an interesting discussion in itself. So I think what's important here is, to answer the question, and I focused on diaspora, most people don't actually understand about the history of empire, how extensive the movements of people were. And I just want to, there's one phrase that the 20th century Sri Lankan-born British scholar Sivanandan used to describe exactly this reality, that there are the presence of immigrants from former colonies in Europe is actually a direct consequence of European colonial expansion. He used the phrase, or it's ascribed to him widely, we are here because you were there. We are here because you were there. And so there are a few implications that follow from this, right? That we have a shared history. So this is part of what knowledge expansion and fact sharing needs to do, that give you and I a shared history, that give diasporic peoples and immigrants a shared history in the history of this country. A lot of scholars of colonial history want to emphasize that the view of colonialism as having happened kind of out there, over there, across the oceans, it is not accurate. We have to allow the story of the colonies to affect the story we tell of the metropole, not only to have kind of nostalgia for a narrative of pure origins or some sort of pure, purity, but actually Christianity, the Commonwealth is a hybrid reality. And I think we have a lot of inspiration that we can draw from. We shouldn't be, as people of faith, scared of this reality, because Christianity itself was a hybrid faith, bringing in elements from Greek and Jewish and Gentile, and so we need not be afraid of this way of thinking. That's a very
Thank you.
answer.
Christianity is sometimes referred to as a translation religion, isn't it? That's that sense of enculturation being right at the heart of what the Christian faith is. Peniel, can I turn to you next? This question of identity.
Yes. For me, identity brings together the questions of being, who we are, belonging, who do we belong to, and becoming, where we are going, what we are becoming, in that sense. And when we, the one thing, the painful loss that came with colonial expansion for me as an Indian Christian was the uprooting of my forebearers from their Indian roots towards a Christianity, which they constantly resisted. My grandfather, my memories of my grandfather was a teacher, but he was also an evangelist in a church. And every Sunday, and this was the only time when I saw him wear an Indian dress. But every Sunday when he went to the church, he used to dress in a dhoti and an angavastram, a shoulder cloth, went to the church. And our church was a church which was known for its Carnatic music, its lyrics. And also V. Santiago that I mentioned, my great-granduncle, was somebody who emphasized the indigenization of Christian faith in the vernacular languages. It is not that they did not know how to speak English or to read English, but despite that, their understanding of Christian identity was something that was always held in conversation with what they had inherited as the Christian faith, a critical conversation, a creative conversation, but an ongoing conversation in which they themselves were changed. The fact that my grandfather wore a pith helmet, a civilian pith helmet to the school where he taught is a completely different story. But that was a secular place, and therefore I don't know why, probably it was because of the sun. But those are the two images of my grandfather. And the fact that you can hold these two things together in conversation are not necessarily always in opposition to each other is something that I learned. That the way in which we reconcile ourselves to history, to what you might sometimes interpret as being encroachment in even as you navigate your identity, is one that is best done in conversational style. So I think what is also important for me, I think despite the painful loss of cultural uprootedness, I think there was also a resilient refusal towards the estrangement of Christianity from its universal DNA. And constantly the refusal to parochialize Jesus Christ as belonging to a different context or time was something that characterized the way in which my forebearers worked and reworked the Christian identity. So they refused this foisted loss by saying that we will reclaim Jesus, and Jesus will reclaim us. And it was in this constant dynamism that the questions around identity and the questions about what could be possible loss was, it was almost like mitigating the loss. It was like, what do you call this? Preemptive measures to make sure that Christianity was not completely, what could be an umbilical cord does not become a stranglehold. Yeah. Yes, it becomes a source of life. What can be source of life can be a source of death. Yeah. And therefore to refuse to let that umbilical cord become the stranglehold was what my ancestors, in the way in which they were forging their identity, were trying to do.
That's such a wonderful and creative image. Ishaya, identity.
Okay, in connection to the question of some of the things that in my African context, we lost as a result of colonial expansion. So the first one that I will speak about is the concept of family. the concept of family, how the family, in Africa, when my elder brother's children, they call me daddy, they don't call me uncle. I'm like a father to them, and things like that. So, but when it comes to, there was a disruption, and I think even the issue of that you are talking about diaspora, but if we take it backward, during the colonial slave trade, for instance, there was a lot of disruption when it has to do with the context of family. It's one of the things that really bring our identity together. So one can be able to see that family was disrupted as part of colonial expansion. And then the second part is the issue of culture, which Pinel raised. There are a lot of part of our cultural heritage. I was privileged, based on your recommendation, Rainey, I went to the British Museum. I went to the British Museum, and when I got there, see a lot of things, artifacts that came from, especially the Benin Kingdom and things like that. And these are some of the things that maybe when you go there, you might not be able to find some of these things there. So the conversation around culture, here am I seated with suit, and things like that. So there's a lot of things around culture that one can be able to point to. And then the other one is based on language. Today, part of the British expansion, part of the tool was the colonization of the tongue. So today I speak English more, and things like that. So these are things that even form our collective identity that were affected by colonization. And then the other one is the conversation around religion, the African indigenous religion. The African perspective is a little bit different from what Pinel experienced. So for us, there is a conflict, between these two. When you become Christian, one of the things is for you to turn your back completely against the way your ancestors used to worship. And one of the ways that we were taught to turn our back is the kind of naming that was used to name our ancestral way of worship. So it is called paganism. It was demonized, and a lot of names that was attached to it. So these are some of the things that we see, in terms of colonial expansion that we lost when it has to do with our communal way of being. And I think one also is the conversation around education. And that is why today you continue to hear conversation around decolonization of theology, decolonization of education, and even the way in which we know, the way in which we do research. There's a lot of conversation around going through indigenous knowledge system, even in terms of agriculture or whatever. There's a lot of conversation around that. And part of the reason this conversation are there is because most of these things were lost as part of the British or part of the colonial expansion. So these are some few things that I can be able to point, that help to bring our collective identity, but in one way or the other, these things were even contributing, making us to ask who really are we and things like that. Yeah.
That's a very profound thing to say. If this series of cultural moves forcing you to ask, who are we? Who am I? And who am I in relationship to you? Who are we as siblings? Friends, in a minute we're going to move on to our third section, which is under the title of Hope. But I'd like you to be thinking about the sort of questions, comments you might want to make briefly at the end of this evening's seminar whilst we do so. So hope, what is the basis for our hope together, given what we've established about the complexity of memory, the complexity of identity, how that's been received, celebrated, lost, mourned, interrogated? What's the basis of hope? Professor Clark asks it in a particularly poignant way. He asks, what is the basis of hope for a reciprocal and mutually enriching Commonwealth? A reciprocal and mutually enriching Commonwealth. He gives three potential categories, although there will be more. The first is economic justice. The first is individual and community freedom, and the third is ecological well-being. Economic justice, individual and community freedom, or ecological well-being. I wonder if this time we might start with you, Peniel.
Thank you, Jamie. I think if we infuse the grammar of solidarity into this grammar of alliances, I think probably that could be a good starting point for hope, because alliances are good, but sometimes there is this little bit of strategic alliances which might come in, whereas solidarity is there is a certain unconditionality to solidarity which mirrors the love of God that we as Christians have encountered in Christ, and therefore reflecting a little bit of that generous solidarity or the deep solidarity that one has learned through Christ into, of course, the Commonwealth is not completely a Christian body. I realize that, but as Christians, I think the basis of solidarity can still be a source of hope in this world when it comes to economic justice, individual and community freedom, because our freedoms and unfreedoms are often tied into the question of power, which is almost like the glue that doesn't hold us all together, but actually tears us apart in some ways. So, and also the thing is, there is one more thing that might be a good starting point for hope, and I usually call that, also in Christian language, what can be called the Pentecost of the years. Very often people like to speak, the Pentecost is celebrated as the story of many tongues. And there are many people who are actually speaking in this world who have usurped the voice of justice and peace in today's world. But actually to develop or cultivate what can be called the Pentecost of the years, where we listen to each other as part of this common body, where we give up the space of speaking, but take up the role of listening, is something which can help us to be more attentive and probably develop responses to some of the pressing concerns of the world. In the context of war, who do we listen to? Do we listen to politicians who barter ecological plunder as the price for peace? Or do we listen to the voices of those people who are actually at the receiving end of violence and then start working peace initiatives from there? In the context of ecological devastation, whose voices do we listen to? Or are these the voices of people who will not have a voice tomorrow because the island nations on which they are living are drowning? Or do we listen to the groans of a groaning creation, a sighing creation? How do we listen? Listening as being attentive to the silences, the struggles, the unspoken sighs, and that probably leads us to Sati's thing. By the way, I forgot to tell you that Sati was my teacher and is a good friend. So that should have been in the first session, but better late than never. So that would be something that would move us beyond words to dreaming. That would move us beyond wealth, which can be transactional, to worth, which is completely not transactional, but built on the intrinsic recognition of oneness, which connects us, and again the theme of solidarity which goes in. So solidarity can be a starting point for hope in the Commonwealth, and how we redefine this alliance, how we reimagine this in terms of solidarity can be a starting point.
Thank you so much. Ishaya.
Yes, thank you. For me, I like the concept of solidarity that Peniel used. And to add to that, in terms of individual and community freedom that lead to well-being, one of the conversation that I would like to add is the concept of humans as created in the image of God, human dignity. You know, a lot of time there is conversation around human rights. You know, is something that someone can give you. We're having that conversation with you, Mark. It's something someone can give you and the person can take. But when we base flourishing, when we base well-being, you know, the foundation of the conversation begins with the dignity of persons. That this person have a dignity, and this it's inherent in them. It's not something that someone gives to you, and it's not something that that person can take from you. So once that becomes a foundation in our conversation, I think it will lead to a lot of, it will lead to well-being. It will lead to a very good conversation around solidarity and things like that. And so that's for the community and individual. And then when it has to do with the ecological well-being, I think there is a need to begin a conversation around understanding that the environment can live without us, but we cannot live without them. So if you look at it from the context of the creation story, the Bible said that God created the environment. He created everything before he brought human into existence. So there is this kind of symbiotic relationship. And when we begin to engage in conversation around that, to talk about sustainable stewardship of creation, it leads to accountability, it leads to responsibility, it leads to a point where we understand that the environment is not just for us to plunder the way we want to plunder it, and things like that. So I think conversation, our kind of concept and terminologies that we use in engaging in conversation about well-being and flourishing is very, very critical. And then when we talk about the concept of economic justice, I think I like the biblical idea of stewardship, and I like the concept of jubilee, and think there's a lot of conversation now from about debt cancellation and things like that. So what kind of terminology do we use in engaging, in talking about flourishing or the well-being of people? So I think for me, this is very, very important. And based on my theological background, most of my conversation and foundation, I want to base it more of concept from scriptures that can be applied to humanity in general and things like that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ishai, very much. And Rennie, hope.
Yes, thank you. Professor Clark's question about the basis of hope for mutual flourishing and enrichment and reciprocity, well, I think it assumes that there are still barriers to mutual enrichment and reciprocity. So for a few seconds, I just want to kind of give my take on what the remaining barriers might be to true reciprocity. And forgive me for now throwing yet another post-colonial concept at you, the final one, I hope, for tonight. And that is, a lot of scholars use the term belatedness, that there is still the idea that former colonized nations are kind of arriving late to development or historical progress. And most of all, the thing that is kind of most troubling for me personally, it's really difficult to kind of, how do you get around the problem of seeing former colonies as an arm or an appendage or some kind of branch to the central trunk, the image I was using before, that we're still trying to catch up with the West or develop the tastes that get us the endorsement of the West, right? So there's many different other terms to describe this, temporal lag, or mimicry is another one where, the kind of naming conventions that we might have, or the actual literal tastes that we develop for foods, but also for music, for literature, the way that we dress, to sort of show that we have been are more than just an appendage that has arrived late, this sort of thing. And I bring this concept up because I think that the modern Commonwealth has actually tried to make very concerted efforts to redress these exact inequalities that stem from the historic metropole-colony relationship. I mean, you can see that there are attempts to do this by shifting, for example, the focus towards a voluntary association of equal members. So each voice has, as an organization, has a voice, regardless of its former colonial status, whether it was a colony at all, in fact. One significant change that I'm aware of in the Commonwealth structure is the departure from the requirement that the British monarch must be the head of the organization. And so you can see that there's an attempt to redefine the leadership role of the Commonwealth and its head. But I guess the question is, are these institutional changes quite enough to get us past the historic assumptions of, the siblings with a father and the assumptions of colonial belatedness? There's so many ways to describe this relationship, of precedent and its derivative, right? The kind of the center and then its outgrowth, a prototype with its evolutionary and evolutions, right? So I think this is a big task facing the modern Commonwealth, and it's very interesting to see how it navigates these questions. And I want to, if just for kind of one brief last moment, reflect on this dilemma with reference to one particularly important event that happens every year in the life of the Commonwealth, and it happens here at the Abbey, which is the annual Commonwealth Day service, in which representatives of the 56 Commonwealth nations gather. And this was, in fact, the image that was on the advert for you to attend tonight on the website. I think, personally, it's a fascinating service for so many reasons and hopeful reasons. It points to this language of a common dreaming that Professor Clark has used. I don't know if you've experienced the service, but I was able to in person for the first time this year, and it's kind of typical Anglican service in many respects, in that there's nothing extempore about it. It's all very planned. Yes, our minor canon does a spectacular job of ensuring that it down to the microsecond, there's no departure in any way. There's also nothing quite provocative that's supposed to it's supposed to represent all the members, and so we try not to make people squirm in their seats and not have too much kind of discomfort. So it's fascinating. I mean, the way that it tries to do so many things. It's a service, as you know, that embraces many multiple faiths. We had blessings given by members of the Buddhist and Zoroastrian and Muslim and Jewish communities. It's a promotion of the Commonwealth and its ideals, and we all stand to affirm our belief in the Commonwealth as a force for good and influence of good. And nevertheless, it's still explicitly Christian, isn't it? We're at the Abbey, we're at a Christian site of worship. There's a bidding, there's an opening prayer that makes reference to God's grace. We say the Lord's Prayer. There's readings from the New Testament which speaks of Christ. And then there's, in keeping with Christian tradition, there's a retiring collection that doesn't go to the Abbey or the Commonwealth, but goes to a charitable cause. And so, I mean, what I want to ask or say, really, and please correct me if I'm wrong, any of our esteemed attendees and panelists, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but am I right? Is there any other Christian service in the world for any other multilateral gathering of nation states that has a Christian service? Is there a Christian service for any other kind of multilateral gathering of nation states? Like the UN, I don't believe, has like a service of prayer and worship and dedication. NATO doesn't, World Bank doesn't, G7 doesn't. So I think that the Commonwealth Day service is quite unique in this regard. What is this uniqueness that I'm pointing to? This kind of betrays my idealism, I guess. But in a nutshell, it is the theology of the Commonwealth, isn't it? That the hope that you've asked about doesn't lie in us, it lies in the divine, in God. It's a service of dedication, a service of faith, it's a service of prayer, it's an act of worship, although embracing, not in a dogmatic way. It's not in a dogmatic way that it does this. And so we acknowledge the past, we pledge ourselves to build a peaceful future, but it's all grounded, in theory anyway, on an appeal to the transcendent God. And so, yes, maybe the expression of it is perhaps all a bit, now I have to be careful what I say in front of those who organize and lead it, the service. But perhaps it's a general, and there's a display of unity. It may be a bit, for some people it may be a bit forced, it might be a bit awkward, kind of the performances, and also it can only last for 60 precise minutes. But I do find myself thinking rather evangelically about this, maybe to my surprise, that the hope is in this act of faith and prayer and dedication, even if it's awkward and there's a lot of deficiencies or dissatisfactions from historical contingencies that make the relationship still a bit awkward. But it is the kind of common dreaming, sort of like the Olympics. You want to believe in the dream, right? Even despite the issues and the flaws, but you want to believe in what it stands for. And so I do feel like that there's a quite symbolic moment that expresses a lot of the hope. In its essence, it doesn't lie with us and the painful past and the flaws of history, but there is a greater hope. The hope lies beyond ourselves.
That's right.
Thank you. I think this sense of common dreaming would be a really wonderful place at which we have arrived tonight. The closest parallel, I think, to the Commonwealth Day service in terms of its multilateral and interfaith in some way nature would be the gatherings that Pope St. John Paul II convened in Assisi for prayer, and which Pope Benedict then did convene one actually later on, but John Paul II was very evangelical for this sense of prayer for peace together. Friends, we've got a couple of minutes, maybe just for a couple of questions or comments. I wonder who from the floor is bursting to ask one or all of our extraordinarily eloquent and highly distinguished panel something about what they've said or what we haven't said. Sir Charles Gore.
Ken and Hawkey, thank you for the most wonderful evening, and to our panellists for most fantastic contributions. I wonder if I might ask you to reflect on the position of London as a place that is hopeful. We've been talking about linear and non-linear, historical, geographical, but it seems to me that London is hopeful in the sense that it is one of the few locations that unites the diaspora from across the Commonwealth and provides us with a hopeful opportunity to engage in discussion, dialogue, building these co-fraternal relationships. And the thing that's close to my heart, the encouragement of freedom of religion or belief, which is so important in our world today.
Thank you very much indeed. The place of London within all this, particularly as it relates to diaspora communities. Who would like to say something about that?
Well, let me just say that for your question, thank you very much. For me, I'm new in London, so I don't have an answer to that. Yeah.
Rennie, you talked about diaspora particularly.
Yes, I don't know how else to answer this question other than the fact that I love London. I am completely signed up Londoner. I live in South London, and it does pain me. Well, so how do I say this? Oh gosh, there is such a beautiful magic about it. Diaspora and migration and immigrants are can be seen as a gift, but increasingly they are also seen as a liability or as a danger, as leeches, and so the question is whether what vision of the future you have and where your confidence in London, the soul of London, if I can phrase it this way, is. do we retrench and have a defensive posture, or do we believe that the best gift is in this multiplicity of origin and a multiplicity of faith and perspective? And so the kind of gaining or regaining a confidence in just how London was built is a great task. I mean, I see this played out in all sorts of ways. So, politically, obviously, but in small places like my son's, South London and Kent Football League, every Sunday and Saturday where we train, you see the kind of racial and ethnic questions being played out all the time in places in the sporting arena, in having to deal with cultural differences that are, it could be quite shallow, but really can be very deeply painful. On the bus and on the tube, the sort of perceptions that we have and how we negotiate what can be quite natural discomforts because people eat differently and smell differently and speak on the mobile phone differently and all of those things. I think what is the task for kind of political leaders is to articulate confidence that there is something of value here. We've kind of lost the articulation of what is beneficial about it, and we don't really know how to describe the value that this adds anymore beyond what it may be the language of the 1960s, which might not work anymore, of melting pot and like assimilation and acculturation and multiculturalism, even the melting pot of cultures. I mean, we need some new way to articulate just what London has done that is a vision for the rest of the nation, the Commonwealth. I don't know if it's, sometimes I wonder, is it too idealistic? But that's the role of political leaders, isn't it? To take an ideal and then to help us root it down and articulate it in words and policies. And,
I think I'd like to ask my colleagues in Westminster Abbey Institute to start working on that very topic before they leave the building this evening. You've identified a really fundamental question, I think, for us politically. Maybe time for one more very, very short question. Catherine Pepinster, thank you.
Thank you very much for all your contributions. I wondered to what extent, for young people and children in the various countries that you know, Christianity still seems to be something from the West. For example, when they are given a children's illustrated Bible, do the illustrations show Christ as a white man, or to what extent is Christianity still being appropriated for young people in your countries as something that comes from the West?
Shall I just?
Penny, why don't you start?
I think the answer to that is a yes and no. In some places, still, the white Christ is something that still occupies the Christian imagination. But in many places, and because of my work with USPG and my previous work with the World Council of Churches, when I go there, I increasingly encounter Christ in indigenous forms. I've just come back from the Philippines, and what you see there, and from New Zealand, what you see there, I think there is this, some people have spoken about it in terms of unthinking the West, right? There is this unthinking of the West from the Christian imagination in many of these countries, so that Christ becomes the really incarnational Word of God who became one among us. And one among us means all of us rather than some of us.
Thank you. Ishaya?
Yes. So from the Nigerian context, we see this question in two ways. The first one has to do with churches that emerge out of national missionary agency. So for instance, you have churches like the Anglican Church, which came out of the CMS. So to a certain extent, the conversation or the imagination about Jesus Christ still carries this idea of a white Jesus. But of course, there are a lot of conversation around, how we look at this concept of Christology, within the African context, and particularly within a Nigerian context where I come from. And then the second dimension has to do with churches that emerge, or churches that we call them the African initiated churches or African indigenous churches, which to a certain extent some historian might see these churches as a kind of a way of decolonization or resisting some kind of colonial element that tend to impose itself in terms of approach to Christianity. So it's both ways, just as Pinel explained. It's both ways. There are some who still see Jesus white. There are some who, try to say, okay, this Jesus is like me and things like that. So it's both ways.
Yeah, just to problematize that a little bit, in some countries where in the context of growing religious nationalisms, sometimes these attempts to indigenize and inculturate Christianity are interpreted as attempts at proselytization. And when Christians are in a minority, that becomes the fact that Christ and the Holy Family are shown as one among them, becomes fuel for targeting Christians on the basis of attempting proselytization. So it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, Christianity is constantly told that this is a foreign religion. And on the other hand, when Christians try to indigenize and there is this indigenization, it is interpreted as a means of proselytization, which is, and recently in some parts of the world, I do not want to name it, but probably you can figure it out, people have asked for the death penalty for conversions, both and usually perceived and imagined conversions rather than real conversions. So we can go on that, but
Thank you. Renee, do you?
Yes, thank you for that wonderful question. And if I am permitted to turn it on its head slightly, I think, so the context I'm most familiar with, Hong Kong Christians, the Christianity in Hong Kong, to make a sweeping generalization, is very vibrant, very sincere, very, if you can use the term evangelical, it's very fervent. And so the question of, white Jesus paintings or art or images is sort of moot in a way, because the relationship with Christ tends to supersede or transcend this immediacy of art. And in fact, actually, the perception, whether rightly or wrongly, is often made that here in the West, in England, we've got lots of painting of Jesus, but do people have, the perception is, the question is raised, do Christians in England have a personal, fervent relationship with this Jesus? Does a painting of Jesus, whether white or black or brown, inspire true faith and true prayer? And this is a problem that people tend to ask about Western Christianity, of the extent to which a cultural Christianity and the established church, that the Christians have the same sort of experience of fervor and devotion and faith. And so, all that to say, I think when you were using the word kind of a co-creation of meaning, there's a co-creation of religious meaning that actually goes beyond the color of how Jesus is painted. In a way, we've moved beyond that conversation. And the challenge is, what are Christians in the West, which aspects of Christian experience and devotion and the expression of worship and expression of faith, which aspects is Western Christianity willing to have shaped and to be molded by what we may describe as kind of bolder, more, what's the right word, evangelical or Pentecostal, or these other expressions of faith that are very much flourishing in the global South. And so that's another question for the Institute and for your work, in fact.
Possibly for a future seminar, indeed. Yes. Friends, I think we need to leave it there. It's been an exceptional privilege to hold this conversation in this place, the church where the Commonwealth Day celebration happens, a church at the heart of London, which has such a complex and contradictory relationship with Commonwealth and Empire, former imperial capital, and yet one of the most multicultural cities in the world. And I think our three panelists this evening has shown us that this sense of common dreaming, moving from wealth to worth, really is possible. So on your behalf, as well as on my own behalf and on behalf of the Dean and Chapter, a huge thank you to our three panelists for this evening.